So good Wednesday morning to some of you, good Wednesday evening to others. So I'm speaking to you today from the future, unless you're from New Zealand, that's right, where I'm in Sydney, Australia, as Magda mentioned, where it's 2:30 a.m. on Thursday. But before I begin talking about our topic for today, I'm going to share the screen here. And wish me luck, and please give me a bit of patience if this doesn't work. It's actually my first time doing this on Zoom. I'd like to actually start by doing an acknowledgement of country. So this is something that's customary at the University of Technology, Sydney, which is where I'm currently working. And it's also something that's commonly done in the city of Sydney, which is the local government area where I work and where I live. And so, as I've mentioned already, I'm dialing in from Sydney, and I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and recognise any Indigenous people who may be zooming in here from elsewhere in the world. And in addition to that, I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening. Wherever you're dialing in from, whyever you're dialing in from here, and just say how wonderful it is that technology can enable us to connect like this. It's very exciting. So, I'm going to see if I can actually change slides. Here we go.
Awesome, Susan. So let me maybe end the poll, because that might be a little helpful for you with your session. So last chance to vote on the poll, because I'm going to be closing in 5, 4, 3. Okay, 2, 1. Anyway, end poll. And I'm going to share results.
Cool. A lot of people heard of design thinking. Great. Somewhat familiar, and people's backgrounds. A lot of coaches. What a surprise.
Yeah, so
I can scroll down, or can I? Oh, yes. Sorry about this. You wouldn't guess that I work in technology, would you? Okay. Fantastic. Wonderful mix of different people here. Fantastic. Well, this is very exciting. And as you may have gathered by now, I am super excited to be speaking to you today about a topic that I'm passionate about, as well as to be part of Co-Chair's fantastic series. I've worked with Magda in the past, as Magda mentioned. So great to be back in touch with a fellow excitable human being. I've asked Magda in advance to please jump in if I start to slip into jargon, if I start speaking too quickly, which might happen if I get a bit excited, or if I stop making sense, which I'd like to be able to blame the time for, but I'm not sure that I really can, to be honest. I'm also grateful to have Meenakshi here, which you'd also be able to see on your screen as a fellow panelist. So Meenakshi will be here to help make those connections with some of those previous webinars that have taken place in this series, including, and no less than, her previous webinar, which was on boundaryless meetings and inclusive design, I think. And Meenakshi also has a whole lot of experience within this design thinking area. So really like to welcome her to sort of chime in and sort of share any anecdotes as I come along. So full disclosure, I am not a coach. I'm only just starting to learn about the wonderful world of coaching. And so that said, in my discussions with Ram, I can see a huge amount of synergy between coaching and design thinking. And Ram, I can see you there as well. I'm hoping that you're going to be able to jump in whenever you feel it's appropriate to make the connection between any of the things that I'm sharing and with coaching more explicitly. So on to the topic. Design thinking. So to give you some context into my thoughts on this topic, I thought it might be useful to share a little bit of my background. So my bachelor degrees are in science, majoring in psychology and genetics, and social science and policy. I fell serendipitously into this area of design thinking, human-centered design, towards the end of my combined degrees after returning from an exchange semester in Vancouver in Canada. And At that time, I didn't know whether I should do an honors, study something different like documentary filmmaking, or enter the workforce. My first role was with a large scientific research organisation called CSIRO, which is here in Australia, where I was able to apply my psychology, social science background to the design of novel technologies with a focus on the area of health. And this is where I first came across that area of human-centered design, which unintentionally and subsequently became the launchpad of what's ended up being my career over the past 15 years or so. So after several years at CSIRO, I decided to engage in this area more intentionally. I began a PhD in interaction design with a focus on how human-centered design could be applied across different cultural contexts, and spent 3 years working with communities in South Africa, which I absolutely loved. So this resulted in my thesis on culturally tailored design, which relates to a lot of Meenakshi's work on inclusive design. So the actual writing of the PhD took many more years than I originally planned. And so while finishing this and avoiding my thesis writing, I worked for several design agencies, startups and universities. And the work was mainly in Australia, where I had the opportunity to apply some of my culturally tailored design learnings, working with several Indigenous communities, in addition to a project that was based in Hong Kong doing research with a large financial institution, which was in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So I've loved working in this area, but I've also observed many significant changes over the past 15 years or so, many for the better, which is great, in this increasingly popular space. So having a wide range of experiences and seeing this industry evolve over time has shaped my perspectives on what human-centered design is. And I wanted to put that into context before I actually started to share some of my thoughts around human-centered design, because I'm somewhat opinionated about this area, and there's a whole wide range of different perspectives and thinking on design thinking and human-centered design. So I feel like this is useful context. So it's actually one of the things that I also like about human-centered design, the fact that it's constantly evolving, that the methods, the tools, the techniques that are evolving, the sort of people that are coming into this area, the areas that it's being applied to are constantly being evolving. And I think it's one of the things that make this a relatively not hierarchical area to work in. So in some industries, you work your way up the ladder and you become increasingly the expert. Within human-centered design and design thinking, one of the things I find really exciting is that people just entering the field for the first time can have just as much to offer as people that have been there for quite a while, because of their different perspectives and the different tools, techniques and things that are emerging. So it's a very exciting space to work in. So I'm going to click on to the next slide. What is human-centered design? So a helpful way of describing human-centered design has been captured on this great slide, which was created by some of my talented former colleagues at a human-centered design agency in Sydney called Tobias. So they've got a little sign down the bottom. I'm going to share a link to their website at the end as well. So in here, human-centered design is a creative approach to problem solving. Starts with the people that you're designing for and ends with solutions that are made to suit their needs. So it's a philosophy, or what I like to say, a mindset and a set of values, not necessarily a precise set of methods, but one that assumes that innovation should start by getting close to users, or whatever you want to call people, users, customers, whatever your language is, and observing their activities. So you can see a picture of someone there called Don Norman. He's a co-founder of the Nielsen Norman Group. He's one of the fathers of this area and has written this book called, I don't know if you can see this in my tiny little thumbnail, The Design of Everyday Things. So this was published quite a while ago, a few decades ago. It's an oldie but a goodie, and I'm going to share a link to that at the end as well, if that's something people are interested in looking at. So as I mentioned, design thinking or human-centered design, it's not new. It has been around a very long time and well before we started using either of these terms. And so you've heard me say human-centered design a lot, and I guess you probably came in here expecting a design thinking seminar. And so what is human-centered design? What is design thinking? What is, the difference? Is there a difference? So design thinking is a term that was popularized by IDEO, which I'm guessing a lot of you have probably heard of, which is a design consultancy, and it was popularized around the 90s. And in my opinion, it's essentially an attractive way of describing what is essentially human-centered design. So without wanting to be overly academic about it, I will try to refrain. I have a preference for using human-centered design, and a lot of my fellow practitioners will actually share this. But I do think that calling it design thinking can be very useful, especially when discussing design thinking or human-centered design outside a design or a technology context. So design thinking or human-centered design attracts people from all sorts of backgrounds, in all sorts of industries that can apply it in all sorts of ways. There are many courses that are now offered in this area. And so there's an increasing number of people who are now formally trained in design thinking or human-centered design. However, around 15 years ago, when I first entered this area, people were less likely to have formal training. So rather, they were brought together by this shared set of values and a shared mindset, hence the slide here, which is, I really feel that design thinking, human-centered design is really underpinned by this shared set of values and the shared mindset. So my PhD supervisor, Tony Robertson, describes this design thinking or human-centered design process as not only a good thing to do, but rather something that people have a right to. And so what I mean by that is that people who are affected by a solution, a service, a technology, or a program not only should be part of that process, but they have a right to be part of these things that are actually going to affect them. And this is a very common view, especially for practitioners in the field of Scandinavia, where I'm going to introduce another term here, where participatory design was born. But I don't want to get too much into the definitions of participatory design and human-centered design and design thinking, because we could chat about that all evening, and that's not why we're here. So instead, from this point onwards, I'm going to mainly refer to this area as human-centered design, which is a nice segue into some of the core principles of human-centered design. So this is another slide that was put together by some of my former colleagues at Tobias, and it captures four key principles of human-centered design. So one, put people at the center. Another one, embrace diversity. I think that relates really nicely with a lot of the things Meenakshi has formerly or previously spoken about. Bring people on that journey, and not just bring people on that journey, but actually co-design actively with them. And then there's the fourth, which is build to think and test to learn. And I think that's build to think and test to learn. I feel like most of these are fairly self-explanatory. Magda, Ram, and actually please stop me if you feel that's not correct. But build to think, test to learn is maybe that could be a little bit confusing. And so I wanted to give you an example of what that fourth principle is really trying to illustrate. So what that is trying to say is that rather than just having a whole lot of ideas for whatever it is that you're thinking about, written on a whiteboard, in a diary, on a computer, if you're a designer, on Post-it notes all over a wall, there's something to be gained by trying to pilot, prototype, or make something of these ideas happen, and not only see what you can learn, not only that, but you can see what you can learn in that process of trying to turn that idea into a reality. And when I say that, I'm not talking about turning your idea into a reality in in a full-blown way, but rather trying to look for low fidelity ways of doing that. Now, this may be jargon as well, so in case that is jargon, I wanted to give an example, and I might just go out of the screen because I've been told this is going to be too little. Let's see how we go. Don't know how I can stop sharing. I'm still sharing, aren't I?
There should literally be a stop sharing button.
I know, right? I am looking for this stop sharing
Maybe
button.
Zoom needs to human-center the design a little bit more.
I reckon. Okay, let's see. I'll
That's okay, Susan. Just show the thing.
If you guys, I can stop sharing. Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Hello. Hopefully I can start sharing again as well. Okay, so imagine you have a great idea for a phone app or a website. Instead of waiting for that perfect idea before you're designing anything, try to sketch some things onto a piece of paper. And try to see if you, and maybe many pieces of paper, so many screens and many pieces of paper. Because, and you don't have to be good at drawing. I'm certainly not good at drawing. You can, I'm gonna show you an example of something I've been working on recently. You can overuse Post-it notes instead of being able to draw. It's amazing the sort of design decisions or constraints that can come up when you actually start trying to turn something into an actual thing. And something that might seem or feel really simple, all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, but what about in this context? What happens if this person does this, or they don't have a, what do we do then? And so not only does it get you actively thinking a little bit more about that idea, but it's a really nice thing that you can start to put in front of people and test that idea that you have. So you might think it's amazing. There might be a whole lot of evidence to support that's amazing, but when you actually start turning it into something that's quite tangible, maybe that experience of it will be a little different. So the example of these screens that I'm showing you, so this was something that we did for a website redesign at the university. Started off at a very high level with these big categories. Then we started to get a little bit more specific about the words that we wanted to use. We used this to get feedback before we then started engaging a visual designer who then helped us come up with some screen designs, who then socialized that with some other senior stakeholders around the university to get some feedback. So by the time we then took that to developers and worked with developers to build that, we'd already tested, iterated, and we're pretty sure that we had something that was an appropriate match for what we actually needed. So that's what we mean by the build, test, learn. So by sketching things early, by testing, by designing and then testing again, we improve our chances of coming up with something that's appropriate. And speaking to Meenakshi earlier, and she actually has a really nice agile example from a previous webinar. So I'm going to hand over to her.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. So this actually, when Susan was talking about this, it reminded me of, I think, Coach Arya's one of the first webinars for 2020, which was on agile coaching and the use of agile principles in coaching. And this agile, the key principle, especially in the Scrum framework, is inspect and adapt, and you learn. And that's exactly what Susan just talked about, where you build a prototype, so it's something really small, and then you get feedback right away, and you're involving your customers. So if you're talking in terms of software development or product development, then you build a prototype, get their feedback, and then you iterate again. And extending that to the world of coaching, especially in my experience, particularly in the agile, because agile is also a mindset. It's not something that you can just attend a class and say, okay, now today onwards I'm agile. It's really not. It's a mindset, and it's a culture shift. It's a paradigm shift. So in that context, what I've seen as a parallel between that and extending that to coaching is, if if you're coaching an individual or a group, not only having that coaching agreement in place, but also being willing to revisit that agreement as and when needed based on what you learn in that process. So build, test, and learn, and then that iterative loop. So inspect and adapt. That's what I wanted to share. Back to you, Susan. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Meenakshi. So I'm going to see if I can work out how to get the slides back again.
Yeah, as you're doing that, I mean, I would love to invite Ram to jump in with any connections he sees, but like what's coming up for me as you're talking is, coaching is all about listening. And it's about your coachees, your clients' agenda, not your own agenda. So as you're talking about, working with the client, getting feedback, for me, that's the big parallel. It's really focusing and coaching on the client. And if it seems like the client wants to go a different direction, that's the client's choice. It's our job to listen and to have the client's best interest in mind and treat them in a conditional positive regard and go where the client needs us to go, not where we want to go.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, just to add to this, yes, coaching, but I would see a much greater parallel between systemic approach to coaching than individual approach to coaching as far as design thinking is concerned, because it's about, if you're working with a team, if you're working with a whole organization, then you really need to approach it from the perspective of human-centered design. You really need to go down to the people, empathize with them. You need to initiate discussions. You need to get back from them whatever the pain points are. What potentially are they requiring? And then engage with them. The word that you use, Susan, about co-creating, co-visualizing, collaborating, or whatever those words are. And then move into this process of what you said as think to build to think, and whatever after that to test to learn, I think, was the whole process is there. It becomes very similar to agile, because you're not really talking about, I'm going to wait till the end and dump this whole thing on somebody. You are constantly working on it in incremental possibilities, which is very, very akin to Kaizen, the continuous improvement process. And so multiple things, and this whole process, to my mind, brings together multiple kind of processes. It's design thinking, human-centered design, whatever you might want to call it. It builds in something on agile. It has its coaching principles, outcome to action, all that is happening out there, a far more emphasis on action as it should be, because in traditional coaching, when you're looking at the competencies, many people, especially if they are doing with individuals and if they are learning, they don't even see what the purpose of action is. Okay, I mean, you talk about the action in the class session, whatever it is, but the real learning happens when you actually put it there out in the field and you start learning from the action, and that's where the anchoring happens, without which coaching is absolutely useless. And that's what you find in reality, that coaching doesn't work very often, because you think that it's all in the head, it'll happen. It won't happen. The neuroplasticity requires that you work on it for 6 months before something really happens. And that requires a whole approach in terms of maybe continuous improvement, Kaizen, or even like a Six Sigma approach, which many of you as techies would be familiar. It's not about the end point, it's about the process. As you keep going on the process, are you continuously learning and moving forward? So yeah, I would like to really emphasize the point. Once again, that's my favorite evangelical passion about systemic coaching. I think individual coaching truly has no place except as a part of a larger systemic coaching effort. And design thinking fits in beautifully with that. Over to you, Susan. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's actually quite a nice segue into the next slide, which I will try to. Is this sharing?
Yes, it is.
Okay, fantastic. So there's two more things, two more kind of principles that I wanted to add to those four solid principles. And the first one is stop knowing, start listening, and observing. And that relates to, Ram, I think what you're talking about in terms of going out in the field. And this feels like it's a mantra that keeps constantly being repeated in my head, and is often a pain point with me, depending on what kind of stakeholder situation I'm in. I think one of the wonderful things about human-centered design is how liberating it is not to know, actually. And I also feel like this goes against a lot of what might be drummed into our heads during school. I think there's this pressure to know the answers. And with this knowing, though, and assumptions, it can actually, unfortunately, lead us to solutions or designs that aren't actually appropriate or fit for the context. And so human-centered design involves asking a lot of questions and trying to look at understanding a context from many different angles. So, for example, in one of my earliest telemedicine projects, when we spoke to doctors about who was involved in a certain procedure, they told us in interviews that it was just them and the patient that was in the room, and that's all we needed to consider in this technology design. But when we actually spent time there observing what happened during these procedures, we observed that at any one point in time, there were 5 or 6 other people in that room doing quite significant things that were relating to that procedure. And I don't believe that the doctors were trying to mislead us. I'm guessing they're just so focused on what they're doing that it actually feels like it's just them and the patient in the room. But actually there are a whole lot of other people there. And if we hadn't tried to explore in multiple different ways understanding this context, then it's quite likely that whatever the solution is that we would have come up with wouldn't have necessarily been appropriate. So I think this is actually another segue into a really wonderful case study that Meenakshi was telling me about earlier, which is a great example of an innovation that sort of came about by really understanding and observing a context. So if I hand over to you, Meenakshi, do I have to stop screen sharing or will it just go to you?
Yeah, I have unmuted myself, so I can talk and you can keep your screen on.
Okay, great. Right, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So this was something that I first learned about when, as part of my grad school education with focus on healthcare. So the context is set in Africa, and it is in the public health space, and that meant vaccination. So how do you get vaccines to the endpoint? So it was we actually studied this case study under supply chain, which is very interesting. And the problem that was at the core was, how do you get vaccines from point A to point B in a temperature controlled environment? So thermostability is key for vaccines, as we all know. So that was the problem. And what the case study that we read, and what I remember from that now, is that there was an entrepreneur who, going back to, in this context of stop knowing and start listening and observing, took the time to observe something. And he or she observed that, Coca-Cola, you see Coke everywhere. So how do they get to the remotest parts of the country or the continent? And so that was the start of this brilliant, innovative idea, where then from a supply chain perspective, the packaging industry had to be involved, because what they decided to do, and this is what was narrated to us, was that those containers that or crates that had the Coke bottles, you had space, in between the rows of bottles. And so the design was in such a way that these vaccines were put in those crates using the space in between. So the packaging had to be done in such a way that the vaccines use the empty space between the rows of bottles. And so there was no additional tweaking of the design that needed to be done for Coke itself. And then they could take advantage of the supply chain mechanism that Coca-Cola already had in place to make sure that the vaccines reached where they needed to reach. So it was such a brilliant use of available resources. And this is another thing that when Susan and I were chatting, we were talking about our respective experiences. And what I have seen and observed is that the places with the least amount of resources sometimes are have the most phenomenal of innovations, and this was an example of that. Back to you, Susan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, I just think that's such a fascinating and fantastic example of what taking this sort of human-centered or design thinking approach can actually lead to. So there's another, the other principle that I wanted to add in addition to the 4 and the one that I've just shared now is humble is good, embrace humility. If we want to be truly human-centered in our design process and in our mindset, this frequently requires us to embrace humility. And this may be something that will come more naturally in some professions, in others. However, I can say that it feels like it's the opposite dominant mindset in some areas. So for example, in advertising and in marketing agencies, who often look to their creative director for guidance and genius and the answers, this is kind of the opposite of that. So instead, it requires us to put aside our assumptions and create space for other ideas and insights. And sometimes it may require us to step out of the way. So for example, there's a project that I worked on recently, which was looking to support first-year Indigenous students' experience. And we were exploring whether this would be possible using a wellbeing application. So using our human-centered hats, we wanted to make sure that we involved the students that would be using this wellbeing app in the process and co-design with them. But we were also aware that for multiple reasons, it was a sensitive context. So it was a sensitive cultural and it was a sensitive social context as well. And so for these reasons, rather than running the design or the co-design workshops ourselves, the team decided it would be more appropriate to explore ways of empowering the Indigenous students to run workshops with their peers. And so as part of this process, we trained for Indigenous students in basic design techniques, and then we encouraged them to either use the techniques that we shared with them or do whatever else they wanted to do. And we also offered to help them in whatever way they wanted us to. So if they wanted us to be hands-on, we weren't going to force them to run their own workshops, but we also offered for us not to be involved if they didn't want us to be. And so the 4 facilitators decided to split into 2 groups. One of the groups involved us quite strongly and closely, and they used a lot of the techniques that we shared. And the other group used some of the techniques, they created their own activities. And then they asked that we only hang around in the background in case they wanted food and coffee. And one thing that surprised me was that how, even though it was fantastic that the second group felt empowered enough to tell us that they only needed us to get food, it felt like a bit of a rejection, like, oh, they don't need us, they don't want us. But I think for me, I feel like it's a wonderful reminder of how, even though it may sound like an easy thing to do, to embrace this humility, it isn't actually necessarily an easy thing. And that was quite just quite a good reminder of that gap between, oh yeah, be humble, and then actually really experiencing and trying to be that in practice. So that particular project is continuing. And I think one of the most positive things that came out of applying this approach and this process is just how supported the students felt and how supportive they are of that project. And they reported in subsequent interviews feeling really empowered, and this being like quite a different experience to other projects that they'd been involved in. And so I guess regardless of what the outcome ends up being for that particular project, I think that there's something to be said about this process, at the very least being empowering for the group of students. So if you're actually interested in hearing more about that particular project and that process, I'm also going to include a link to an academic paper that came out of that at the end of the presentation. And so you can feel free to look into that if you like. No pressure. Okay, so I know that the topic here was design thinking is design coaching, something along those lines. And so I know I'm not a coach, but I also feel like there's a responsibility to not completely ignore the topic. So this is my attempt here. Again, everyone feel free to jump in. So this slide, I put together this slide based on a video that Ram posted on the differences between mentoring and coaching, and then a subsequent discussion that I had with Ram recently about this topic. And so in that particular presentation, Ram describes some of the key attributes of a mentor, one of those being as an expert, someone who has this advisory role, who can tell you what to do, what you may need to do. And also that the role of mentors are important, and there are contexts where mentors are needed. But there are some key differences between mentors and coaches. And as far as I understand, the coach's role is starting by understanding that person, tailoring that approach to that individual, and doing a whole lot of asking. And I think one of the descriptions that Ram used that really stuck in my head is this idea of the coach getting into the DNA of a person and identifying what's blocking them and helping them to achieve their goals and desires. And so I hope, Ram, you don't mind me taking your metaphor rather literally here, but I've got here the worm that turns into that butterfly, and that's sort of like part of that DNA, and I'm blocking that to become what they actually can. And I guess similarly, human-centered design seeks to understand people's needs, their motivations, their behaviors, with the hopes of tailoring that service, solution, product, technology, or whatever it is that you want to fulfill that person's need and improve their experiences. And so from what I can tell and what I can see in my limited exposure to coaching, and from what I understand of the human-centered design or design thinking literature, it feels like there's an enormous amount of synergies between the two, and that there's a lot that we can learn from each other. And I guess to bring it back to the formal title of this webinar series, it really does feel like design thinking is all about coach thinking, and coach thinking really is all about design thinking. And with these two, there are wonderful opportunities to be part of designing a more inclusive, sustainable, and considered future for everyone, which I think is incredibly wonderful and a privilege to be part of. So I'm not sure, Ram, if I've misrepresented mentoring and coaching, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to hand over to you for a brief comment on that one before I go to my final slide.
No, not at all. Yeah, though people may sort of put it differently, but you're absolutely correct. There has to be an energetic connection between the coach and the client. The coach really has to get into the skin of the client, inside the mind of the client, pretty much, in a sense, be the DNA of the client. But at the same time, he is not the DNA. He has to be aware of that as well. And therefore, there should not be any attempt at any kind of solution giving. There could be no telling. But can you empathize? And Otto Scharmer uses a beautiful word, one of the most beautiful explanations of what a coach's activity should be. It's called generative listening or generative viewing. That means you actually, when you sit in front of the client, you see the client as a client wishes to be, but not quite clear. But you as a coach, are you able to see the future of that client more clearly than the client himself or herself, and be able to, in some way, slowly, patiently, without telling, be able to move that person towards that by evoking the awareness within that person? There seem to be a bundle of contradictions here, but that's the beauty of coaching, because you don't know. You're going totally not knowing. The moment the coach thinks, oh, I know this is what needs to be done for that person to get from point A to point B, you've lost the plot. And for those of you who are not familiar, we make it more or less mandatory now for all the batches that we have. We like them to watch a series of 3 videos called Gloria being coached by Carl Rogers, Albert Ellis, and Fritz Perls. Carl Rogers, of course, most of you who are in coaching, you should know about Carl Rogers. He's the father of coaching, client-centered approach, which is very similar to the human-centered design that you are talking about. Albert Ellis is rational, emotional, behavioral therapy, very psychological, Jungian, post-Jungian, and Albert Ellis Gestalt, which is a breakaway kind of methodology, very powerful. And in this particular batch that Cindy and I are working on, several people sort of came back when we asked them, we told them, please put down your views that just spend 3 hours on coaching. Amazingly powerful insights. But one of the things that came up across again and again, we wish that Carl Rogers sort of heeded Gloria's pleas for telling her what to do. And so my response to that was, Gloria is a 30-year-old woman, divorced, and has a 10-year-old daughter, and he would like to have relations with men so that eventually she could find a long-term partner. And Carl Rogers is a 6-year-old man with strong Calvinistic Christian traditions. What can he know about the situation that Gloria is in to be able to offer any kind of advice? So he just keeps questioning her, inquiring her, moving her forward. He's putting himself as deep as he can into her mindset. But at no point in time does he open his mouth to say anything that would remotely be suggestive. And that's the beauty of coaching, because you as a coach do not know. And I think design thinking is pretty much in that same thing. Till you try it out again and again, you keep tweaking, and you eventually arrive at what is the perfect solution. Until such time, you do not know. And that's where the similarity I see is extremely powerful. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ram. So I guess the final slide that I actually have here, just a bunch of thanks and some links for further reading before I open up to Q&A. So the yellow and black slides that I'd shared earlier were thanks to Tobias, who are the human-centered design agency that I previously worked at. I've got a few other illustrations here. For example, this beautiful little, caterpillar. I knew it wasn't a worm. Caterpillar that turned into a butterfly. Okay, 3:15 a.m. I hope I can blame the time. So that's actually a colleague of mine who I'm working with at the moment at the University of Technology, who is a business analyst, but an incredibly talented artist who is yet to, but maybe this is the beginning of following his dream to be an artist. So he is starting an Instagram page, which is sleeper_illustrations. The paper that I referred to, there's a link here which will take you directly to a PDF version. Otherwise, you're going to need to go through a bunch of academic firewalls. Few suggested readings. So I mentioned Design of Everyday Things, but my number one favorite, well used, much too used, Magda will recognize this book. I don't know if I can just show you in the thumbnail, but it's called Game Storming by Dave Gray, and he has a bunch of wonderful different activities that you can do for co-design sessions and doing things in ways that are quite inclusive of different groups of people, regardless of their personality types or their positions. So the link here will take you to thegamestorming.com. There's a whole bunch of free resources that are on there. So I actually think all of the activities that are in this book are actually there and more. So I highly recommend that. That's the one book that I've pretty much taken everywhere with me because there's so many great activities. And then the third one, I need to thank Meenakshi for reminding me of this one because I almost forgot. Interaction Design Foundation. They have a wonderful selection of free courses and material and reading up there, and that stuff is solid. So if you're interested in this area, interested in finding out a little bit more and further either exploring human-centered design or the relationship between the human-centered design thinking and activities and coach thinking, then highly recommend that one. And finally, I've got my LinkedIn down here. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you do, I request that you please just write a little note saying that you met me or saw me here through Co-Chairia, because I do sometimes get some requests that are a little bit odd, and I want to make sure that I accept you. So that'd be great. Otherwise, thank you. It's been very exciting to be part of this. Any questions? Or anything, Magda, Meenakshi, Ram, that you want to add?
Yeah, Susan, I don't have questions as such, but I just want to put this up for you. I mean, somebody has asked, Prasad, someone, the videos suggested here related to human-centered design. Perhaps some of them are, some of them are not. But I think Meenakshi has provided quite a few links to IDEO and Acumen and so on. You can always go there, and there are excellent courses. In fact, I went through about a dozen of their courses, each of them about 30 hours over a period of time, various aspects of design thinking and human-centered design and so on. It's really worth doing it. You don't have to pay for any of them. That's the beauty of it as well. And design thinking is not about sitting and learning about it in a training room. It's actually going out there and practicing. It's an experiential learning. One of the things that came up for me, Susan, and for you, Meenakshi, as well, is one of my very good friends, an old colleague of mine, Sanjeev, he's here. I see his name in the panel. And there are several people from Delhi here. And Sanjeev and I were talking about, you won't know the background, but there's a local government in Delhi who has started doing things for the last 4 or 5 years in the fields of health and education, which I thought was amazing, truly brilliant. How do you take health to the people, education to the people, make them as low cost and free as possible, all kinds of stuff. And I'm sure they are doing something about it. But one of the problems that has been pointed out also is that they are relying too much on experts who tell them what to do, rather than really going down to the people and probably finding out from them what it is. I was just wondering whether you had, based on your experience in South Africa and so on, both of you had worked in, and what Meenakshi was sharing in terms of how they managed to put medicines in between Coke bottles or whatever it is, how they do it, make it accessible to people. In the field of health and education, which could be extremely powerful. So some of our friends who are from Delhi, I don't know, maybe they as coaches to take a kind of a larger role, a systemic role in terms of trying to help the local government to be better than what they actually are, better than most of the states in India. Any views on this? How design thinking can be applied to taking health and education to the masses?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guessing Meenakshi will have some ideas about, so would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first? It's up to you.
Why don't you go first?
I think there's a few things that come to mind with your example, Ram, and your question. The first one is not necessarily answering this directly, but I feel like it's related. And that's actually to do with the culturally tailoring of approaches and methods. So a lot of our methods, our tools, our approaches, actually a lot of these things that are in this wonderful book that I absolutely love, they're often Western derived methods for Western contexts. And I guess this is something that I looked quite into a lot during my thesis. I think there's a whole lot of really interesting new innovative methods that are out there that tailor the approach for the cultural and the social context. So one of the things that came to mind is some really wonderful work that a lady called Apala Chavan has done in India. She created something called the Bollywood technique, which she was doing user testing of websites, and when she actually involved people in the user testing, everyone was like, yes, it's all very good. Yep, it's all very good. And people were quite reluctant to sort of criticize any of the designs. And then she realized that, and I am absolutely not going to claim to be an expert in the Indian context here. So I think Meenakshi and Ram, please correct me if I'm wrong here at all, but just relaying her stories, she was saying that there was a more comfortable culture of being critical when it came to Bollywood movies. And so she tried to set up a kind of like a game type scenario where she used Russes and tickets and like turned it into a little bit of a game that then encouraged people to be more open and to be more openly critical of that by putting them in the mindset of criticizing Bollywood, I guess. And then that ended up eliciting a whole lot of other feedback. So she was able to get a lot more rich contextual feedback by tailoring that method to the community that she was trying to get feedback from. So I think that's one of the things that come to mind. I guess with my South African context, one of the biggest turns that my thesis took was I was working with a group of artists to look at how the internet might be able to be used to sell their artwork online and reach new markets. And I wanted to take a co-design approach with this community of artists that were living in a township. And they were like, sure, but we don't know you. Fair enough. So then we started doing a whole lot of introductory workshops. As we got to know each other, it became apparent pretty quickly that even though they had heard about the internet and they actually had the internet, they didn't really actually understand what it was, because back then, like, this was still, say, 2010, not necessarily that long ago, but still pretty early days of prevalent mobiles, and people had gone from not having any access to all of a sudden having the world available at their hand and not necessarily having a reference point for what that actually meant. And so so I was then wondering, like, how meaningful can your participation actually be if you don't really necessarily understand that context that you're designing for? And so here in Australia, we can generally take for granted that people understand what the internet is, but over there at that particular time with that cohort of people, they didn't. And so storytelling is a traditional way of passing on knowledge, and that led to thesis turning to the creation of a play which through theatre and through storytelling explored the possibilities and limitations of the internet, to then share a certain amount of understanding of what the internet was and what it wasn't, to enable then the artist to be able to participate more meaningfully. So I guess those two examples I'm trying to share as examples of when I think it starts very much with this human-centered and the coach thinking, understanding that context and what makes sense for the people, and trying to reach people and empower people to actually have that meaningful say. And sometimes there's certain groundwork that needs to be done before that's actually even possible. And I guess that's what the play was there in that particular context. Nakshi?
Susan, before Nakshi jumps in, can you stop sharing your screen so we can see your lovely faces?
Yes, sorry. Yes, absolutely. Okay, sorry about that. Okay.
So the only thing I would add to what Susan you just shared is understanding the context and also the constraints within which that particular group of human beings function. What are their existing constraints? And the healthcare example, I have two, one in the US and one in India. The India one is, I think, at least more than 10 to 12 years old. This is in a fishing community in the state of Kerala. And because of the, ubiquitous use of cell phones, and India's, until now has been the cheapest market for mobile phone use for cost of data. And so texting is very popular. And so this was, the context is that of providing information to community health workers to know if there was any sort of an emergency, and this is for female reproductive health. And so if you look at it, the context has a lot of taboos around, being able to talk about female reproductive health openly in a small fishing village in the southern state of Kerala. So those of us that are from India and familiar with the different regional contexts already can think of the many constraints within which this particular set of women that they dealt with on a daily basis. So the technology that was brought into use was very simple. It was SMS, texting. And then in order to deal with the constraint of taboo, the different, the most commonly occurring health conditions were codified, which is a technique that's used in disease surveillance in the public health context. So this kind of condition could mean it could be 0-1. 0-2 could mean this condition. So all the women had to do was text just the code. So they just texted 0-1, and the community health worker got the message and they knew what it was. And then that helped them figure out the level of urgency with which they had to respond. This was very successful in the beginning. And I think that one of the constraints that hadn't been thought of before was who really owned the mobile phone? Was it the woman or the man of the house? And if it was the man of the house, then the access the woman had or didn't have to the mobile phone. So just because technology exists, we assume access automatically happens. So that was one example where it was successful, but then they did meet with some challenges as they went along. The other example that I can think of in the US, this is something I've studied from an academic perspective. So the concept of customer journey maps, and this is something that I think, as a sidebar, I think is a very valuable tool in coaching as well, because you sort of you're able to articulate using visuals, just even if you write it down, the journey that you as a coach and your client want to make and co-create that. So that's the sidebar. But then the particular instance that the case study that I had read about was in the US. There is this concept of there is this publicly funded healthcare benefit, which is called Women, Infant, and Children. It's commonly referred to as WIC, W-I-C. And women that qualify have to be below a certain income level, and you have a very, very stringent application process to qualify. So one of the common things, tendencies for us as humans is that those that don't have a lot of opportunity, the haves and the have-nots, the haves tend to think that if you belong in the have-nots, then you somehow automatically lose the power of choice because you have very little to begin with. So beggars can't be choosers. So you somehow don't qualify to have choice. So that was really sort of brought out. And so the team that came in to redesign this process, again, they started, so the WIC cards to begin with were, they were not electronic. So you had to get your vouchers. The women had to go and get their vouchers. And in order to get their vouchers, they have to have completed an appointment with a local nutritionist. So if this woman had other kids, then think about the things that she had to take care of. Maybe she more often than not would have an hourly paying job with no leave benefits, which means she had to take time off from work and lose that pay. And secondly, then she would have to figure out childcare for her other kids and then make it to the appointment and all of that. So just like Susan, you were talking about that example where, when the doctors in that healthcare setting, they were probably not, thinking about, they were so focused on what they were doing, they were not thinking about the other actors. That was the case here. So originally the way it was designed, which is all paper-based, so the radical approach, the pivot that this design team took was, hey, if you can recharge your phones without having to, electronically, why can't we do the same for the WIC cards? And so they actually did a customer journey mapping. And that's when they discovered all the pain points that these women faced, including the ones that I listed, and how humiliating it was for them to use the vouchers at the point of sale in a grocery store, because then everybody around them knew that they were on government support. But by converting this to an electronic form of payment, they took away that shame that was associated with that transaction. So these are two examples in different cultural contexts that I can think of, Ram, to your question in the healthcare space.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we have reached the end. Just to quickly answer two questions I think that were asked by Anuradha and Ruchika. I mean, Anuradha, the process period depends really on the complexity of the situation. It could be from 3 months to 3 years, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, but then it's in like in agile, it's continuous. I mean, you keep on doing something, and therefore people don't lose hopes. A little bit of success brings more motivation and so on and so forth. So, but the thing is, and that is where the coaching approach, I think this fits in extremely well. You need to spend, we keep telling people when they are learning coaching, spend at least 20 minutes in the 60 minutes for a coaching conversation on agreement, what is called CC2. And it's extremely important. Without a full understanding of the needs of the client, not the wants of the client. There's a huge difference between needs and wants that you need to understand. The needs of the client and why is it important? What is it about? And how would it be evidenced? And so on and so forth, those who are familiar with PCC markers. So design thinking comes with the same approach, extremely important. Then the whole process of how do you communicate, how do you create awareness, how do you build relationships, etc. And then finally, in terms of action, it's far more detailed than what coaching would suggest superficially, but not very different. So I don't think there is just one part of coaching which touches upon design thinking approach of human-centered design. I think it's the totality of the coaching framework, totality of leadership competencies, totality of design thinking. These are all absolutely the same, and I think it's far more relevant and systemic. Okay, Magda, you said that you had some question to ask, whatever. Otherwise,
well, yeah, but then you went in and you started talking, so I don't have it anymore. No, let's just wrap up, I guess. Yes, we could do an entire series on this, and yes, there's a lot of overlaps. But I'll start with you, Ram, then I'll go to Meenakshi, and then I'll have Susan to have the final word. What if there's one thing that you want people to remember from today's webinar, one application, design thinking and coaching, what is that one thing, Ram?
I would put that one thing in 3 words: co-creation, collaboration, and communication.
Okay. Yeah, I think you cheated a little bit, but that's okay. Meenakshi?
Ram stole all my words. For me, it's empathy and co-creating value. So coaching not for the sake of coaching. What's the true value and what's a value for the client? So empathy in figuring out what value is and co-creating that.
Thank you. Susan?
I think I'd say listen with space to really consider that other person's, if we're talking about a coaching context, that other person's context, their needs, their motivations, their behaviors. I think one of the ways that I commonly, sorry, I'm talking too much, describe human-centered design is understanding human-centered design, in short, understanding people's needs, motivations, behaviors, use that to apply that to create better experiences, more appropriate services. I think same with coaching, but really listen, listen with space to be surprised, I think.
Cool. I like it. Thank you so much to our panelists today. And Susan, it's so lovely to see you in a different context than our previous lives. I love when worlds collide. So, you know, we were talking about human-centered design, and because we're all different humans, this particular recording, this webinar, will be available for those of you who want to watch it. It'll be on YouTube. For those of you who want to listen, it'll make its way onto our podcast. And for those of you who want to read, it'll make its way onto our blog with some key insights, as well as all the different links that Susan shared, as well as there were some great resources that Meenakshi was sharing throughout the conversation and that some participants shared. So if you've missed something, please don't fret. Give us a day or two and then head over to coacharia.com/blog, and you will not only see all those links, but you'll also have links to the audio and to the video. And for those of you who want to claim continuing education credit for this particular webinar, I am posting the link now. It's already in there. But in case you do miss it, most of you should know that you just go to learn.coacharya.com, and in there, there's a section for all courses that qualify for credits. And today's password is book in print. Why is that the password? Because you'll see all the different options talk about the wonderful things we already do with our content at Coacharya. That's knowledge is free, and we do a ton of it. What we have not done yet is a book in print. So that's today's password. But it's also a nudge to Ram, who's written like a bazillion books. Let's finish a few of those to a point that we can print them. And it's also a nod to Susan, who I've known for a few years. And when I met Susan, she was working on her thesis. When I became colleagues with Susan, she was working on her thesis. When I became really good friends with Susan, she was working on her thesis. And when we stopped working together, she was still working on her thesis. And now, Susan, please, you do the honors. It's done. She's a full-fledged doctor, and her thesis is printed. Please show us, because I thought it was amazing.
It's
show us.
Okay. Oh.
Sorry, I'm embarrassing you, but I don't care. Look, she's got her own book. So yay. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming today. It was lovely to, well, not see you, but to see you. And we will be back here next week with another amazing speaker and another relevant topic where we will all learn something from each other. For now, thank you so much. Susan, off to bed.
Definitely.
Meenakshi, off to lunch. Ram, off to the phone call with me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.